Борь, слушай сяву, блядь!
A new day begins on the Ukrainian front. It is no different from the previous ones. The sound of incessant gunfire continues in the background, and the furious explosions resonate like an echo of death. The only thing left to know is where the enemy bombings will fall today, a lottery that no soldier in Kiev intends to win. The Russian fighters seek to strengthen their conquered positions, but the local forces refuse to lose control of their lands. For this battle, the Ukrainian government called in one of its best units, the 3rd Assault Brigade. But despite the skill of this troop, the outlook is not easy. The fighting in the trenches becomes increasingly brutal. And suddenly a group of soldiers is trapped under enemy fire. Still wounded, they must face a powerful and savage rival who is not afraid to kill anyone who crosses his path. In this new video from Military Force, we will once again enter this fierce conflict to learn a new first-person story. Stay with us, and let's discover together how the renowned Ukrainian brigade risks their lives to regain control of their country.
Звідки працює?
З усіх сторін.
Блять, як би це не звучало, ну з усіх сторін майже, блять. Треба уточнювати.
Що у вас там за хуйня?
Сказали идем, сказали назад. Там пиздуют нахуй, мы в этих. Кто куда залег. 2 дрона летают.
Да ёб твою мать, блядь.
Просто, якщо буде все.
Since the start of the large-scale invasion unleashed on February 24, 2022, the war in Ukraine has given rise to thousands of brutal and violence-filled stories. Millions of citizens have been forced to leave their homes, and dozens of cities have been reduced to rubble. However, in this case, we will focus on one of the regions that became the scene of the most intense and prolonged battles of the conflict so far. This is Bakhmut, a strategic point for both sides, where the fight for control of the city and its surroundings became the bloodiest. This place is of great importance due to its geographical location. It is located in eastern Ukraine, near key supply and transport routes with access to different areas of Donbass, the area of greatest dispute between the countries. Control of Bakhmut can mean possession of a city that functions as a logistics center, facilitating the movement of troops and resources to that battlefield. The most important tensions that triggered the conflict have been generated there. The cause was the presence of pro-Russian separatist movements violently clashing with Ukrainian ultranationalist groups. The two contenders are clear that its capture or defense can influence the ability of both to operate on a broader front. For that reason, on August 1st, 2022, the Russians launched a fierce offensive on this objective, forming an encirclement and beginning a series of attacks. Moscow's forces, supported by paramilitary troops such as the Wagner Group, carried out a sustained assault, while Ukrainian soldiers prepared to defend their lands at all costs. Thus, a prolonged and epic battle turned the city into the center of brutal urban combat. These have been marked by heavy losses suffered on both sides and extremely difficult conditions, with shortages of supplies and intense artillery.
Не прийняв, повторіть.
Підерської посадки залетіла, продивитись вам у спину.
Ух ты, ебать.
The hell unleashed in Bakhmut has represented several faces of the war between Ukraine and Russia. On the one hand, it showed that the Kremlin is a huge and powerful adversary for the small neighboring nation and was able to sustain a long operation thanks to its vast amount of resources. Its infrastructure allowed it to capture a large territory of the city and its surroundings by February 2023. This contributed to the formation of Russian lines with artillery presence to further hinder local defenses. However, despite the fact that Moscow has the means to crush any rival, Ukrainian troops have managed to deal heavy blows to their enemies. In this way, the other side of Bakhmut has to do with the fact that the region it occupies has become a symbol of the country's resistance. When Russian soldiers advance like a bulldozer, forcing the rival to slowly retreat, Kyiv's partners around the world, such as the United States, recommended abandoning the city. The position of this ally, who sent war material to support the defense, was to avoid a greater loss of men on that front and to group together in other sectors. But the Ukrainian warriors were not willing to surrender. In fact, the best fighters were ready to reinforce the defensive ranks and show the invader the courage of their people. You will wonder who this is. Well, none other than the famous 3rd Assault Brigade, a highly trained elite unit ready to face the great challenges of the war. Although this force was officially created in 2022 to combat the invasion of Russian troops, its origins go back several years. The brigade is made up of numerous soldiers who once formed part of the paramilitary group known as the Azov Battalion. These fighters gained notoriety in 2014 when the war broke out in the Donbass against pro-Russian separatist groups, proving to be fierce and effective warriors, even against the powerful Kremlin army. Despite its great capabilities, the group was surrounded by a strong controversy for being pointed out as a movement of neo-Nazi ideology. Faced with this, the Ukrainian government decided to make some changes in its symbology and adopt the unit as part of the country's armed forces. Once the controversy was resolved, Kyiv gained a troop of brave and courageous soldiers ready to finish off any enemy. The brigade is specifically designed for assault missions, with a focus on mobility, close combat, and offensive operations in difficult terrain. Thanks to this, it becomes ideal for fighting in urban areas such as Bakhmut. The unit also distinguishes itself by carrying out quick attacks to surprise the rival, which helps to avoid a coordinated response from the large number of forces that the Kremlin has. Finally, the modern weapons with which it is equipped stand out: light armored vehicles and high-tech equipment that includes drones for terrain analysis and offensive planning. Thanks to all this, the 3rd Assault Brigade has played a crucial role in the defense of Ukraine's most contested city, giving a clear example of its bravery, sacrifice, and determination. From their arrival on the battlefield, this troop knew that Bakhmut was a key objective, and they prepared for intense fighting from a major enemy attack. The first thing they sought was to reinforce defensive positions and establish lines of communication. However, the battle was not long in coming. The brigade found itself immersed in fierce urban combat, fighting house to house. The soldiers' experience was crucial, as they knew the tactics necessary to fight in this type of environment. Morale was high, driven by a sense of duty and the need to protect their land. However, as the war progressed, the 3rd Assault Brigade had to face extreme conditions. Sub-zero temperatures, shortage of supplies, and constant bombing. To fuel their determination to continue forward, the warriors remembered the faces of their fallen comrades. Still, the momentum was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain as they faced daily pressure from an enemy that showed no signs of giving up. The main objective was to keep the Ukrainian forces from giving up, as the emotional blow of a defeat after so many months of resistance would mean a high price in the Great War. With this in mind, the brigade sought to set an example and adapted its tactics to maximize combat efficiency. Ambushes and surprise attacks were implemented using their knowledge of the terrain. Communication and cooperation between units was essential to maintain cohesion in the face of Russian pressure.
Туда граната. Дистанция 20 метров. Повторяю, дистанция 20 метров.
Сейчас закинуть или когда будем продвигаться уже?
Сейчас кидайте, у меня есть возможность вас корректировать.
Throughout the battle, members of the 3rd Assault Brigade performed heroic deeds, rescues under fire and reconnaissance missions that allowed them to obtain vital information. However, the fight was costly. Many comrades fell along the way and many others were wounded. And so we come to a particular event that took place in Andriivka, a small town on the outskirts of Bakhmut. This place had been occupied by Russian forces, who took control and turned it into a fort, replete with artillery to repel attempts to retake the town. The brigade's advance was effective, leaving dozens of enemy dead along the way as a result of the violent clashes. However, the time came to assault the rival lines, mainly with action in the trenches. This type of combat has occurred recurrently during the conflict. Soldiers break into deep excavations in the ground, which are built with the aim of protecting troops from gunfire and shelling. These positions are often in deplorable conditions with mud, water, and a shortage of supplies. There, fighters engage in hand-to-hand duels with constant and brutal gunfire. But in this case, we are faced with a critical situation. Elements of the Ukrainian 3rd Assault Brigade were able to take control of an area of enemy trenches, but ended up as the target of a fierce Russian attack to retake those places.
Горячо, горячо. Сука. Сука, блядь. Ага.
До підерів, ті, що валяються, приблизно 100 метрів, як прийняли.
This offensive against the men of Kyiv is a reflection of a response to a successful assault. The Ukrainian brigade was instrumental in carrying out ambushes and surprise attacks on these types of enemy positions. In this way, it managed to recover part of the territory lost in Bakhmut. However, when the Russian forces felt threatened by the unit, they used their own tactics for an immediate retaliation. This involved the use of mortars, artillery, and drones that caused a firestorm over the Ukrainian soldiers. They could not defeat them in hand-to-hand combat, so they resorted to heavy weapons. Many times the trench warfare that takes place on Ukrainian soil has been compared to the fierce fighting during the First World War. Although more than a century has passed since that conflict, these types of defensive positions continue to be protagonists. What has made the difference is the incorporation of advanced technology.
Давай.
Дивись, міномет, якщо працює перед вами, це наш, якщо...
Reconnaissance and attack drones, guided missile systems, and electronic warfare are an essential part of today's conflict. All of this allows forces to detect and carry out a long-distance offensive against their targets, changing the dynamics of trench combat. This is precisely what the soldiers of the 3rd Assault Brigade of Ukraine had to face in the fight in Andriivka. After being exhausted by fighting the rival and regaining their positions, they became the prey of Russian fire. This is where the Kremlin has proven to be a highly prepared war-fighting nation, with a vast arsenal ready to make the adversary suffer. Even if it loses a position to Kiev's troops, it will quickly seek to make them regret it by turning their lives into a living hell.
Де він, сука? Я тебе чую.
With this attack, the harsh conditions of the battle in the trenches became even worse. The shelter is not suitable for such a bombardment, so several Ukrainian soldiers were seriously injured. This forced the request for reinforcements with an armored vehicle that could accompany the withdrawal from this hot zone to receive medical care. It is at this moment of tension that the mind of the soldiers becomes a critical factor in war. Physical and emotional exhaustion can reach very high levels and affect their performance. This is where an elite brigade makes the difference, especially when the problems keep piling up.
Біро на зв'язку, борт важкий 300. М-ка не їде, там щось наїбнулось. Ну, вся історія. Це не пішли.
Пожалуйста.
Despite the heavy blows, the Ukrainian fighters never gave up. They held their ground, resisting every blow from the enemy and preparing for the moment when they would have the opportunity to call in a new support vehicle.
Парні, М-ка, М-ка!
Finally, after long hours of fighting, the Russian fire began to die down. The Kremlin lines finally broke, and the defenders of Bakhmut, driven by love for their land and the sacrifice of their comrades, managed to repel the attack on Andriivka. The 3rd Assault Brigade managed to recapture the village and hold its positions despite the brutal enemy bombardment. Exhausted but victorious, they gathered in the mud of the trench where silence turned into a song of celebration. In this way, a new story of the war in Ukraine was closed, where the trenches of Bakhmut forged bonds of brotherhood and courage between the fighters of Ukraine. The defense of those men against the invader will be told through the generations as an epic tale of struggle and resistance. Thus, it will remember the importance of always keeping the light of hope, even in the darkest moments. And now, it is time to say goodbye. Thank you very much for having accompanied us to the end. We look forward to seeing you again in our next military force video.